Namaste and welcome to Jaipur Dialogue USA. Welcome to the show. Just before we begin, I wanted to request everyone to subscribe, like, and support the channel. And today we are going to talk about a rather extraordinary situation that has come upon, we are witnessing today, on account of Ukraine and Taiwan. As we speak here, we know that Nancy Pelosi, the U.S. Speaker, is on her Asia journey, and they have not announced whether she will go to Taiwan or not. But China has virtually issued an ultimatum of, of a disastrous, unbearable consequences that will come about. It is virtually a military threat, and as a result of which, it poses a serious challenge to the entire world. Forget about United States alone, as to what kind of a geopolitical system we are going to inherit going forward from here. We also know that Ukraine has posed an enormous stress on Europe and the global relationships, and there is everything being blamed on Russia. United States seems to be a mute witness to the whole thing, although very actively involved. To discuss this entire matter, I have greatest of pleasure in welcoming Ambassador Pradeep Kapur Ji, who is a diplomat belonging to the Indian Foreign Service, and he has been ambassador in many countries. I have great pleasure in knowing him and also knowing fully well that he's not one of the flamboyant definitions of a diplomat, but very serious thinker with deep thoughts. And we would like to talk to you about this, including the impact and implications for India in this matter. And the second guest I have is today a very young man, Dr. Ankit Shah, who is an accountant and an attorney and a doctor with deep student of geopolitical affairs. And I have known him for a while, and his predictions have been on the money, on the dot. Whether it has made him unhappy or annoyed that the predictions came right, because the consequences of those predictions are not always pleasant. So, Dr. Ankit Shah, you are bridging the generation gap between the two oldies, if I may say so, in humor, Pradeep ji and myself, and you, the young man. So, Ambassador Pradeep Kapur ji, couple of words which are very important here. China has threatened United States with unbearable consequences if Nancy Pelosi lands in Taiwan. She is on a five-nation visit, a five-nation tour of Asia, which includes Malaysia, Singapore, Korea, Japan, and a stopover in Hawaii. The issue is very simple. How must the United States respond to that, given in the background of 2 hours of conversation with President Biden had with President Xi, and there is a demand to disclose and release the 2 hour of phone call, what transpired. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I would say that the relationship between the US and China is poised at a very critical juncture. And for Nancy Pelosi, to announce that she is planning to pay a visit to Taiwan at this stage of the history of relations between US and China can tip the scales. There are many things which are happening which will impact on this, judgment or action, because the Chinese Congress is due very soon, in a matter of weeks, actually. And the Chinese have been upping up the ante, and the language they've been using is also been very, very strident. They have not stepped back. They have not left any ambiguity in their talks with the President Biden. Also, recently, as we saw when Xi Jinping and Biden spoke, that you're playing with fire and that you'll get burnt.
Right.
To that extent, I guess, uh, at times like what happened in Ukraine and Russia, Vladimir Putin kept on warning for a long time. The West did not step up and respond adequately. So I think it's time for a lot of diplomacy before things go spiraling out of hand, because you have had the pandemic which has impacted the world phenomenally. The prices have risen, the economic impacts are there for everybody to see, the supply chain disasters, the inflations. Then the Ukraine Russia war has brought the world on the brink of recession and even greater sort of depression. And I think it's time for diplomacy, and India definitely has a very important role to play. Having its very good relationship with both the countries, are not good with China, but at least it's a good talking relationship with China. Our foreign minister recently met at the SEO dialogue, the foreign minister of China also, and I think India should really intervene in a very strong manner to try to see that this does not lead to those outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Pradeep Ji. This is important role to play. This is the time for India to assert itself geopolitically as well. Ankit, I wanted to ask you a very specific question about this, and the question relates to the fact that enemies of United States view Biden as a weak president. Do you think United States has become involved in an imbroglio in which it can't extricate itself unless it asserts itself aggressively? So, how do you see the world order? I deliberately called it the new global disorder, not the new global order, for the simple reason that Chinese supremacy around the world will lead to a lot of realignments. The country, I mean, in my opinion, the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government are not liked country in the world. Nobody likes them because of their tough-handed approach, their known much famous killer contracts. Nobody wants Chinese model, but China is imposing. What wisdom do you see in it? So go ahead, tell us
So,
about your perspective on this.
yeah, I have a very different perspective on this. We have seen whenever there is a Democrat Party in the United States coming to power, you will see a lot of conflicts boiling up all over the world. I mean, if we are talking about the Trump tenure, then there were allegations that he will, start some war, but that never happened, right? So, in fact, what we are seeing is exactly the contrary at this point. Now, when we talk about the Chinese Communist Party, my understanding and my reading is that the party structure was based on a fundamental, two main fundamentals. One was the limit of two terms with the president, and second was specifically the cooperative decision making system which the Chinese Communist Party had internally. Now both of these things are challenged by Xi Jinping. So it is more of like, and I'm not surprised that we are reaching the tipping point where his two terms are getting over, and that particular limits are also gone. And this particular Congress, as Ambassador Sir said, is coming in November this month. And we had seen 5 years back, exactly 2017 National Congress, just few months before that, Doklam happened. So he has this thing of trying to flaunt some achievement before the National Congress comes. And I'm not surprised that these limits would definitely that it is gone. And this is the time when some kind of an action that we are seeing on Taiwan. The 1st August, that is tomorrow, is PLA anniversary, and 11th August is the Taiwan declaration anniversary of Mao, during the Mao's regime, right? So we see that Xi Jinping goes and follows that particular model, which was before these two-term limits were set in the Chinese Communist Party. So I would like to, I mean, after November, I can surely, Hu Chunhua, who was the in the Politburo, the only person, the vice premier, who could challenge as a successor based on the definition which they have on who becomes the president, and that is the last vice premier. I mean, they have passed a law that they can jail a vice premier. I mean, the last year, right? And he was the only potential candidate who could replace him as per the rules. So I look at it as moving towards a Xi Jinping party rather than the communist Chinese Communist Party. And when we talk about a Xi Jinping party and not a Chinese Communist Party, what that also means is that de-dollarization is something which is coming, because the Chinese Communist Party was stabilized and built by free Wall Street finance coming in the 70s and 80s, and the training to the CCP cadres of free trade which was given in the West. So Xi Jinping is challenging not just the Chinese Communist Party internally, but he is going to bring in de-dollarization, gradually phasing out the US dollar from the international monetary system is what he is looking at.
That's a very interesting insight that you gave and you introduced the de-dollarization. We know that India has about 12 or 15 countries have agreed with India to do trade in rupees, but we'll come to that topic a little later. But
Yep.
Ambassador, I wanted to check with you on one thing: is that China's resurgence is reminds me of some of our Hindu sathology truth that happens. That Rakta Bij came about because he got a bliss by praying over time, right? Do you think Kissinger and Mr. Nixon, looking back in history, regret the decision to bring China into the mainframe?
Thank you, Vibhuti Ji, for that question. And I also want to thank Jaipur Dialogues and you and your colleagues and your team here in US and in India for the great work that you do.
Thank you.
And to, seeing Ankit also on this show is a great pleasure. What you say about this is indeed very, very interesting. The perspective that you bring. Because the disruptionist role that China is playing on the international stage is exactly similar to what you just mentioned. The sort of havoc and chaos they have created over the last so many years, uh, from the perspective of Nixon and Kissinger, when they reached out to China to bring them on as a cooperative, collaborative partner on the global stage, definitely, Nixon would be turning in his grave if he has any conscience at all. And so would Kissinger be reviewing the day that they made this outreach through another known devil, Pakistan.
That's right.
So, to sort of kindle the fire in China, they had thought at that stage that they would be able to bring down communism, that they would be able to influence the citizens of China, that they would bring in a large number of Chinese into the education mainstream in the US who would go back and act as seeds of democracy, bring in a lawful sort of regime which is more answerable to its citizens, and more aligned to the Western ideas of democracy, liberty, etc. What has happened is totally different, in the sense that you have had very, very, strikingly non-democratic actions by China, internally and externally. What they have done in Tibet, the Sinization of Tibet, what they have done in Xinjiang, what they are doing in Inner Mongolia, what they have done in Hong Kong, what they have done in the South China Seas with all their neighbors where there are overlapping claims, what they have done on the India border with Ladakh, and the list is just endless, absolutely endless. It is like Ravan type of persona on the international relations scene, who's doing this non-stop actions which are and even the COVID has been ascribed to them, for example. So one step after another, they have been unsettling the world in so many different ways that the world has come to this pass today. Thank you for asking this question.
No, that's very true, because sometimes we have to do looking back, looking forward. And Ankit, wanted to check with you that do you think that the weakness the Chinese people don't President Xi doesn't realize? I mean, he's a smart guy. Do you think he doesn't realize that the world doesn't like him anymore? Nobody likes the Chinese Communist Party. It is like Ambassador said very correctly. They look like Ravan, the Sarup of Ravan. What exactly is going on there? Because this is a mind-boggling exercise. Because there are the facts, truths on one side, and then there is an action on the other side. So share with us, since you have some insight into the Chinese Communist Party and the impending clash which is coming there, because the dictators change the terms and conditions of election, and they win by 90% in a democratic setup. So does the democracy as the structure that the West wants to hoist on others, is it a right approach to do that? I totally believe it's not. Your take.
I certainly agree with you, sir, that there are a host of nations which are not governable in the democracy and an election format. And Chinese Communist Party and the mainland China certainly falls in that category, especially when we see over decades, I mean, for the last 50 years, that it has been the manufacturing hub of the world. I would go a step ahead and say that it is actually the torture of the Chinese citizens which has which has sustained and sponsored the democracy format of the West, right? So the West has been on this suicidal path where it destroyed its own supply chains and manufacturing abilities in order to rake in profits from the torture of the Chinese labor. So it goes both ways. I mean, when you say a global disorder, I mean, if I would go ahead and say it's a disorder for the West, West specifically. And to be very frank and honest, I would, when few years back, when I saw those statements coming in from Russia, when Vladimir Putin signed that particular document, when Xi Jinping signed that document, President for Life, right? And then, I mean, we do have democracy format in India, but then at the same during that same span of time, there was a statement from our Prime Minister as well that the period from 2014 and 2029 is very important. So it was the same days gap between India, Russia, and China, talking about very important years of the lives of these countries. So I do believe that this is an Asian resurgence which is coming up. And when we talk about that 100 years of humiliation with the Chinese talk about, there's certainly a kind of resentment in the Asian countries, be it India, Russia, or China, where they feel that there's certainly been injustice meted out to these Asian nations, be it about representations in the international bodies. I mean, most of the international bodies are funded and denominated with the US dollars, right? If this country is needing some loans, it's again US dollar. All the transactions, it is again US dollar. So this kind of an artificial demand which is generated for the US dollar all over the world, and has, the West has been, there's a feeling that has been quite exploitative of the Asian resources. And I would see in the future that there will be much more collaboration. I mean, the SEO meet has just wrapped up of the foreign ministers, and they're working on a roadmap for national currencies kind of transactions. So countries by countries are interested in bilateral trade pacts instead of multilateral trade pacts. And the primary reason why this is so is because of the hegemony of the US dollar. So I believe that going forward, there could be more cooperation among these nations, including China, rather than Xi Jinping going against all these small nations and cooperating with the West, which it has been doing by supplying all the basic stuff which the West needs for this decades.
I liked what you were saying, that Western hegemony and the dollar hegemony. We live in America, both Ambassador Kapoor and myself. So dollar weakening will hurt our income. It will hurt our savings. It will hurt our retirement income. But be that as it may, like, the question is very important. Like, I subscribe to the thought process that somewhere along the line, has the West gone too far in imposing its own agenda on the rest of the world? And
Especially, so the payment system which gives dominance, the Swift payment system, right? So this gives power to the Western nations to impose sanctions on countries unilaterally. This has gone too far.
It has. Ambassador, coming to you on this, because you belong to a generation which we have, lived with the Western thought process, Western education, and everything else. How do you feel about that? This young man's protestations about Western dominance of Asia. Let's talk about it. It is
Sure.
such a very creating a chaos and a disorder of its own kind. What will emerge?
Well, it's a very, very important subject to be discussing on this Jaipur dialogue stage and on the world stage, because I will first see it from a different perspective, a non Indian perspective, or let us say a non Western perspective also. When I was here in the US in the early 90s, as also besides being a diplomat for India, was also working in the Georgetown University, and that was the time when the USSR had just broken up, just fallen. After all the cumulative efforts and impacts of USA and the Western world, they had finally succeeded in sort of breaking up the USSR. So the thought process in this country at that time was, now that we have demolished USSR, in what remains of USSR, including Russia and the other republics which are now independent, we are going to impose our own models of politics, of democracy, of economy, of market, of everything. Now, for me, coming from India as an Indian diplomat working in the US, and that too as a faculty member in Georgetown University, Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State, she was also a faculty member at Georgetown University. She just passed away recently. Uh, all of them would speak in that same language. So I would ask them the question that if you're going to try to impose these Western systems on Russia, is there any dialogue with the Russians? Is there any communication that you have had with the people there, or what remains of the polity there? And the attitude was one of arrogance, that it is a system which we feel is the best and we will go ahead with it. So that is why the relations between the West and the eastern part of the world, being Russia and the Central European republics, is in such a mess today, because people like Kissinger have written, and a lot of other experts have written, that the West made too many mistakes in its relationship after the fall of Russia, USSR. In the sense, they could have co-opted Russia into becoming a member of NATO, etc., etc. I won't go down that trajectory right now, but just suffice it to say that that has been an important factor, and we have seen that in India with the colonization of the British also. How trillions and trillions, there have been so many studies which show that trillions of dollars of losses happened to India during the British Raj. Now, there is a study by IMF and The Economist, which again, Economist is not a pro India journal by any stretch of imagination, it's just the contrary, and Angus Madison, the consultants, whereby they have laid out the contours of the last 2000 years of the economic evolution of the world in terms of the GDP contribution by various countries. And in that mapping, it clearly comes out that the per capita contribution by India in PPP terms is up to the extent of about a third of the global GDP for the first 1,000 years of the world, from the year 1 to the year 1000. And after that, for the next 600 years, it is a quarter of the world's GDP in purchasing power parity terms of the global GDP. Now, in this whole article in The Economist, there is not a word mentioned about India, but the graphs which are there accompanying this article, when I started analyzing it in some detail, then I realized that the bias of the Western world towards Indian contribution is so significant that the country which has made the most significant contribution to the global GDP in PPP terms for over two-thirds of the world's, three-fourths of the world's existence, 75% of the existence of the Western world history, from the year 1 to the year 2000, not even the our world history, which is tens of thousands of years old, even in their reckoning in the 2000 years for 15, 1600 years. India has been the major contributor to the global GDP. Not a word of that is acknowledged even today in the Western media. So there is this inherent bias and inherent fear that the Asian countries, once they wake up and they start marching, it will mean the end of the Western order and the Western dominance of the world. So, to that extent, the aspect of dollarization, while it will impact the whole world, has been a very profound aspect. Now, what I would also like to say is that there have been some positives also about this contribution by the Western world. In the sense, a lot of the science and advances in science contribution in the world was by primarily by civilizations like India, still the 16th, 15th century or so, till the 12th century particularly, before the Mughal invasion, Muslim invasions started in India. And thereafter, the contributions by India to the world science became advancements of science became less and less because of the disruptions which took place for the last 7, 8 centuries. And the Western world contribution started increasing very significantly. So, to that extent, they have made contributions in so many spheres that cannot be ignored, that cannot be put aside. And this dollarization of the world has put the global trade on some sort of an even keel. Unfortunately, it was a very flawed decision because as long as it was a gold standard at the IMF and at the World Trade till 1971, till Nixon threw it down the drain, there was still some sort of rationality to it, I would say. After taking out the gold standard, the US economy, in terms of its printing of dollar, in terms of its debt in tens of trillions of dollars, in terms of dominating the world trade through dollar only, and not having any rational basis of strength of a nation. Strengths of nation are to be are to be measured by their inherent strengths, what sort of raw materials they have, what sort of resources they have, what sort of manpower they have, what quality of manpower they have, what are they contributing to the world. Just like in a society, an individual family is measured by its contribution or its capacities to contribute. So, unless there is a rational measure, unfortunately, which does not exist today, the world economy is very, very fragile. And once that the bulwarks of that framework start falling apart, then the impact and the results and the repercussions can be very, very severe and very, very serious for all people across the globe. Thank you.
So, so my incantation of new global disorder was quite accurate actually. This is very important, Ankit. I wanted to come to you about that because you talk about de-dollarization a lot, and supported by technology, we are seeing trades and payment mechanisms have changed all over the world. You know, you no longer need to go to a bank to transact a business. Let's put it that way. I'm a former banker, so I know about that. All that you needed to go to the bank was to deposit money, take money out, letters of credit, guarantees, facilities, and whatever. That structure has changed. So share with us, if you can, how will this de-dollarization look like, and where does India figure in it? Because rupee is at 80 rupees to a dollar. But I also read an article the other day that rupee is doing pretty well against the euro and other currencies, only except dollar. So somebody said that in that case, it means transfer your rupees into other currencies, not in dollar. How do you see this emerging out, this entire de-dollarization? If Russia sanctions, again, we talked about that. So people are finding out ways and means of the unilateral sanction that United States, my country, imposes on others. It makes people unhappy. Some point in time, there will be a repercussion. And I said this on this show and others, that what US needs to worry about, that when you sanction others, be prepared to receive a sanction for whatever reason.
So, my view with respect to, I mean, if you have seen after the sanctions that were laid on Russia, if you look at the valuation of ruble, it has pretty much gone up against all the currencies. So, this fundamental prima facie evidence that the US dollar has been able to exploit the domestic currencies of many countries of the world holds true as long as the ruble is concerned after the post sanctions period performance of ruble, right? So in terms of the de-dollarization next steps which can come about, and especially when you're talking about technology, we have seen that the Indian rupee card and the UPI, there are about 30 countries lining up for negotiations on that. India has already been diverging since, I should say, 2016 to bilateral trade pacts, free trade agreements with individual nations. I mean, one of the primary instances has been the RCEP, which China and many Southeast nations were vigorously pushing India for, including Japan and Australia. India just skipped out of that, right? So India has been very clear on this, that we are going on a path where we are picking up bilateral trade rather than multilateral formats. So it's definitely one of the primary step of this de-dollarization, where countries can trade with each other. I mean, if India wants to trade with Myanmar or Thailand or Laos or Cambodia, it shouldn't need a monkey called US dollar to come between the cats, right? So there shouldn't be any such need. So this is what I look at de-dollarization. I mean, each country should be able to get the correct value proposition of what they produce for the world, and that's only fair about it. There's nothing unfair about it. Now, in terms of say what kind of a format that would come up, so BRICS common currency is something which is vetted. SEO is moving towards some roadmap. Again, there was a statement from Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, that the SEO countries can take their individual choices whether they want to opt out of US dollar or not. But I certainly feel that there are countries which are moving about. I mean, Israel. I mean, who would guess that Israel, one of the biggest US ally, would replace a chunk of US dollars from its forex reserves with yuan, and will also do a handover a terminal, a port terminal, to a Chinese company for more than 30-40 years. So there are unprecedented moves which are going behind the curtain. There are many countries. Saudi Arabia had a recent deal with China in yuan for an oil deal. Russian trade was done through dirham, which is a UAE currency. So I believe many countries are behind the curtain working towards de-dollarization, because there has been this assumption and this reading among countries that it's perhaps because the US dollar needs to be reserve currency status that the conflicts are being ignited in their regions. So people do have this reading.
That's very, very useful information. And I wanted to come to you, Pradeep ji, with this element what China Global Times wrote, that the US strategy of withdrawal from Afghanistan, contracting military presence in Middle East, and enhancing geopolitical rivalry with China in Southeast Asia will soon prove useless. This is the China Global Times said that. The US policy has been remarkably ambivalent. We left behind whatever the behind the curtain decisions are taken geopolitically, but running away from Afghanistan, the way we, I would say we, I'm an American, I'm contesting for New York State Assembly candidate as a candidate. So the point is, the way we did Afghanistan looked very bad. And from Afghanistan, from the fire to the frying pan in Ukraine, where is the wisdom in it? Where is the diplomatic wisdom in doing what it did and to what is not visible to the naked eye?
So, before I come to that question, I would like to dwell upon the other aspect a little bit more
Sure.
in terms of the de-dollarization discussion which has happened here, and what Ankit has also mentioned, and what you have also mentioned. Now, what I'd like to say here is that this aspect of dollarization of the world has been very close to the hearts of America, hearts, minds, actions, impacts in every way. When Colonel Gaddafi tried to embark upon this platform in Libya by announcing de-dollarization, you saw what happened in Libya. He was assassinated very brutally, etc. And the Americans took up, mentioned it as a good achievement of theirs, having a head of state killed like that. Similarly, Saddam Hussein, when he embarked upon this path, again there was regime change, there was total disruption of Iraq, and Saddam Hussein himself was hanged to death, etc. So they do not look kindly upon such, discussions or decisions even in the slightest. But what probably has happened now is that they have overstepped their limits in so many ways that the stage has come, and the point the world is at today is that there is a lot of significant amount of countries which have a very important role in the world order who are now taking that decision or embarking upon that path. Now, to some extent, they have been pushed to that path, or their path towards that has been facilitated by the Western and the NATO decision in Ukraine. If before the war in Ukraine they had declared that okay, Ukraine will not become a member of NATO, or Ukraine had passed such a sort of some sort of bill in the parliament or a statement in the parliament that it will not join NATO, probably this de-dollarization of the world could have been postponed for some time, could have been delayed, could have been tackled in some other way, could have been challenged to some extent. Now, with the sanctions on Russia, Russia has an automatic pathway, an automatic segue to de-dollarization. Being supported by China, which is a second most important economy in the world currently, is again giving a lot of momentum to that decision making. Then other countries like the BRICS nation, of which India is a partner, taking similar decisions for the future and putting their contours into place. And also, if you have I2U2, not just the I2U2, but the I2U2 part minus the US, that is a UAE and Saudi Arabia, joining in that decision making, that is going to add a lot of sort of impact and momentum again to that decision. Then you have Israel. If Israel is onboarded completely, which I was not aware of, which I've just learned from Ankit, if Israel gets onboarded to that decision, now if I'm thinking from the US perspective and I'm reflecting as to what has happened suddenly in the last year or less, now how do I challenge it? How do I stop this process against dollarization? It is a very difficult situation that I'm faced with currently because I'd taken a very artificial decision in 1971 to dollarize the world economy and delink it from the gold standard, and that is now blowing up in my face in a very significant way. So the possibilities and the capacities left with me and my allies in the Western world to reverse that trend is now becoming less and less. The tunnel is becoming darker and darker instead of a light at the end of the tunnel. So that is what I would say about this aspect. About China, yes, China, global times, we know what it represents for the world. So I won't lay much, stress on what they have to say. But what they have pointed out in terms of what the U.S. actions have been in Afghanistan, it has come in for sort of universal rebuke and condemnation and criticism. The way it was done, what was done for the last 20 years, all that has been analyzed. And, if you just, but the analysis also is sometimes so flawed because when I think upon it as a global citizen, I see that more than 50% of the Afghan population is women because a lot of the men folk have been killed in all the acts and wars so far. Now, another of the less than 50% male, a very large number is the youth because, again, the youth are surviving, the elders are being killed in large numbers amongst themselves. So, if there is a government in place which is not giving the aspects of freedom and life and liberty and democracy to this more than 75% of the population, which is youth and women, for their free exercise of their rights. And they are living in a constant 24 by 7 shadow of fear and trauma, and not being able to access education freely, not being able to access any of their freedoms. What a society the world has managed to, facilitate in Afghanistan. It's not that the Afghanis are not to blame, but the world itself is also to blame that today we have a society in the world and other countries also heading up the same pathway, where a very large percentage of the population, more than three-fourths of the population of that country, is going to be not having access to good education. If you are going to be trained in madrasas on terrorism and how to fire a gun and how to pick up a grenade and how to shoot people and how to kill people, what sort of education is that? And what is the value of that education? So, to have so many countries in the world going down that path, and Afghanistan already deeply entrenched in that path, and the world not talking about it in a very continuous sort of narrative format, is very unfortunate. So, it's a what China Global Times has said or what the world is saying is still a lot less than what the world should be saying. So, similarly, in other spheres also, we have seen that actions which have been taken are not the best, and some sort of reflection, some sort of pause, some sort of foresightedness, some sort of vision, some sort of thought leadership would have been very useful in taking the world down the right path. Thank you.
No, that is when you said that some sort of reflection, that's what geopoliticians do. They are always playing the long game. There is no taking shot in, you don't short the market in geopolitical terms. So, Ankit, talking about this from ambassador's perspective, that there has to be a reflection. My reflection is on NATO. NATO is essentially a group of people, countries that have come together, and the only thing that we know about NATO is Article 5. You touch my friend, and I'm after you. The entire you hit everybody, right? It's a three musketeer philosophy. All for one for all, right? So that's the NATO principle there. When will China see through this? Given the fact that India never takes leadership role in many things, we are very good allies in various ventures. Doesn't China see through an element that there could be a Pacific Treaty Organization? Why not? There is no other bloc in the world has any structure like NATO. No other country has. No other group has that kind of a military pact. What prevents India taking a lead in establishing a Pacific Treaty Organization, which is, of course, Quad is one of those shapes. Tell us more.
So, my reading has been that the NATO has per se not participated in anything that they ought to actually. I mean, in the Ukraine war, uh, there were no forces which were sent on ground.
But Ukraine is
So,
not part of NATO. That's an
Ukraine is
important.
not part of NATO, but NATO did a lot of the pin pricking, which right now the Nancy Pelosi visit in this particular time zone of August anniversary is coming for the Chinese Communist Party. So a lot of pin pricking is being done by NATO, and then there is no participation when countries like Ukraine or Taiwan actually expect help. I mean, if you just look at the timeline, it just almost looks like a scripted kind of things. I mean, 13 days before Ukraine started, the Russian drills started in Belarus. What was NATO doing? 29 July, the Chinese forces started their drills in the South China Sea. 12 days before, Biden did a phone call to Putin. 28 July, Biden did a phone to Jinping. It almost sounds scripted. 76 days before, Biden said that we are not sending forces to Ukraine. It's been 66th day that US said the same to Taiwan. It almost looks like that the Western alliance is just looking for profits. I mean, routing the profits, US taxpayers' money, through a third country into the pockets of the defense companies, the reconstruction contracts and the humanitarian aid contracts. It doesn't look like that any of the US allies will get any kind of real help in terms of defense or that kind of a thing. So I see the same kind of thing in the case of Taiwan as well. I don't think the United States will actually participate in a full blown conflict with China just to secure Taiwan or that kind of a thing. And in fact, just 2 days back, I think they passed a CHIP Act in the United States. So they are already anticipating that Taiwan is gone, and we have to do something about the chip supply, right? The same thing they passed. I mean, the United States has passed a discussion about leasing arms to Taiwan. Why leasing arms? You are a global power. Where are you? Where exactly is the United States if it's a global power? So this all has been, it just comes out exposing the US company format where, few companies, energy, oil, energy, defense, IT companies coming up and making up a cartel just to rake profits and pocketing the US taxpayers money, routing through a third country. That's exactly what is going on, and it has always been the case.
This will, Ambassador, will this thought process, lead to various countries think and wonder about the wisdom of relying on United States as a long-term partner? Because you are right, Ankit, because that's a thought that baffled, and it is in conversation in the US as well. How important is Taiwan to us? I mean, to have Taiwan's prominence was, among other things, the manufacturing of chips. Now you are shifting it all over here because you don't want the chip to fall into Chinese hands, right? I'm 100% sure that there is a global transfer happening of technology, minds, and plants, and everything else. The same thought comes from about Ukraine as well. All that US is doing is supplying weapons. But is that a solution? That we need to reflect upon. And I think it is very important to be able to figure that out. But one thing I'll say here, before I request you to step in, is United States is a country, including Alaska and other territories that are there, 3 times larger than India, has one-third the population, one-fourth the population, and is a remarkably resource-rich country. It can easily absorb 300 million people, right? The question is US taking itself for granted? Are we creating a traffic jam in our own thinking? Is something which I wanted to hear from you, your thought on it. And in the remaining time, I also wanted to touch upon where does India stand, as we are very, very uninvolved, deeply involved, yet uninvolved. We practice detached attachment to these matters. How do we go about it from here?
That's quite a plate full of questions and aspects to be
You
there.
answer, you talk about what you pick up from there. That's simple as that.
Okay, so the first aspect when you say Taiwan's importance to the world or to the US is mostly about chips and technology and those aspects, and diversifying it from there is one sort of solution. The importance of Taiwan to the world stage is multifold. It's a sort of one of the bulwarks of the fight against violation of rules, aggression, etc. Once it's like dominoes, nine pins, one after the other are falling, and Taiwan is probably the next in the target list. Now, once you succumb, once you give way, you are feeding the demon also in a way. In South China Seas, thereafter, to impose what you have been proclaiming all the time, along with the Quad and other partners, of a rules-based order, independence of shipping, etc., etc., and it's a major route for global trade. So all that is also a question. Besides the importance of Taiwan as contributing to the world stage on the chip side and technology side and other aspects. So, are you going to stand up for all that? If you're not going to stand up for all that, again, you have, by focusing on the military aspects, you are again making sure that the end result will be again contrary to your long term interest. Now, in Afghanistan, also, as I said,
For 20 years, if you analyze the spending of the Western world and USA, what we did there was mostly supporting the security apparatus. There was no deep level, profound level strategic thinking as to how to build a society. While some countries like India were doing that in terms of building institutions, building systems, contributing to the children's nutrition, schools, education, etc., international airlines, so many other ways. But the almost 99% of the US aid and the Western aid was dedicated to the military aspects. Now, the military industrial complex in the Western world is a very important part of the dynamics here, and they play a very important role. So, they are able to skew the decisions in their interest, where the major part of the money is used for their own purposes in terms of new developments, new technology, throwing away the old equipment, paying their own people money, jobs, employment to their own people, etc., etc. So those are the primary deliverables. Now, with that perspective, the recipient country is not benefiting in a long-term strategic visionary fashion at all. So as long as that is the way that you're, implementing your policies, it is not going to result in global good in a significant way in the long term. So we are again poised at another of these decisions. Now in Ukraine also, if we just look at it, I'm not getting into the depths of Afghanistan, etc. I'm just telling you in a holistic sort of fashion as to how I view it, as to what could have been done a lot better in terms of the US interventions there. If they had dedicated half their money towards social goals, probably the world would have seen a different country today. Now in Ukraine also, the entire emphasis has been on this military aspects, aid and equipment and ammunition and artillery and weapons and now planes being discussed, etc., etc. So you are not even trying to foster negotiations or making sure that there is pressure on Ukraine to come to the diplomatic table, negotiation table, and to Russia also trying to say that it's time for diplomacy. You are every day you're saying, okay, 1 million more, $1 billion aid approved for supplying more ammunition, new ammunition. So that is the sort of trajectory that you're propelling those places where already big disasters are happening. So what is happening as a result? Ukraine and Russia are very significant bread baskets of the world, for example, wheat and other grains and other crops. Now, all that has been imperiled completely. Probably not a kilo of wheat has flown out, or if at all it has gone out of Ukraine, is very, very small quantities, totally insignificant compared to the millions of tons that was being sent earlier. So many countries in the world, in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America, are on the verge of economic collapse and defaults and disaster. Because the common man also, when he goes out to buy his bread also, he finds suddenly it is so expensive. He has to keep on thinking twice that should he buy it or should he not buy it? Or can he support himself in some other way? Inflation has gone through the roof. In the US, when I go to buy my petrol for the car, it has increased more than twice the cost before the war. Inflation has gone up so significantly. Recession is knocking on the doorstep. So the impacts which are happening, because this is a globalized world, the impacts are happening absolutely immediately. And you are saying, okay, you are imposing sanctions. Now, are these sanctions hurting the Russians more? Are they playing out in the manner that you announced that they would play out? That Russia would feel weakened, that the ruble would crash, that the economy would fall, that the people in Russia would revolt, etc., etc. Or is it hurting your own people and your own countries more than maybe it is hurting Russia or China today? So, what are these decisions that you're taking which are boomeranging on your countries and your economies in such a significant way that the impact may all and any and some analysis in the future may show that the impact of all these decisions and firstly propelling Russia to war with Ukraine and then imposing sanctions on Russia, the long term impacts on the western world economies may be more than what has been felt by Russia and China in a very significant measure. So if that sort of analysis starts coming out, I mean, you look like very poor quality decision makers, that are not able to really lead the world in a sort of a global manner where the interests of the world are safeguarded, like a Vishwa Guru. So that is where we are currently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The other part which is very important is the human rights, for example. Issues on which United States or the Western world takes pride in talking about it. They ignore those issues when it comes to China and their allies. Is that hurting the global image of the West, that they are only transaction related friends? They are not good permanent friends. What do you think, Ankit, about that? What is the potential impact of that?
So I look at it as double standards because West has been, talking about climate change and then consuming the very products which cause pollution by importing them from other nations. So I do not understand how the change of incidence, point of incidence of pollution, makes any change in the net effect of pollution on the planet. The same case goes with respect to this kind of human rights violation which the West prides itself in. I mean, how many times the West, the look at the frequencies of crimes in the West. I mean, if you look at the per million population crime rates, I mean, the many Western countries would top the chart. I mean, you just look at the gun shootings in United States, for example, right? So I do not understand where, what kind of the narrative the West talks about when it talks about human rights, how it defines its human rights standards, and the indexes which and the rankings which it generates in its reports. I mean, suddenly some country comes into that list only because it has given some given a tight slap on some other section of dealings with the West. It's just like that. I mean, some country, some poor country finds out some resources somewhere, the next day it is on some list. All right, so everybody can read through this kind of things. I mean, the very products which I mean, we are talking about Xinjiang. About 70% of the tomato ketchup get, I mean, the Westerners are gulping it down. So what human rights violation the West wants to talk about when you yourself are consuming the very products which you say you claim to have causing the human rights problems? So I maintain this particular statement of mine that the entire democracy and the freedoms format of the West is sustained by the torture of the Chinese labor and exploitation of the resources of the smaller nations, weaker nations. So I would like West to introspect more on these kind of things.
Thank you very much. We have a minute and a half. Ambassador, I wanted to throw this thought with you that we live in an amazing era of technology driven communications. Look at it. You are in California, I am in New York, Ankit is in Ahmedabad, India. And we are communicating live, same time. Today on Google, I can look at the street traffic condition in a city called Ulaanbaatar for all that I care. We're living in a tectonic shift brought about by technology. So, last 1 minute, Ambassador, tell us there's introspection. We know everything what is happening everywhere. We can't hide anymore. Where does America go here? Now, the image of America is rattled at the moment. As an American, I'm very unhappy about it. It's a very rattled thing. When Putin is blamed for gas price hike, Putin is blamed for political interference, KGB is blamed for interfering in American system. The thought that comes to my mind that we are not taking responsibility for our own actions.
So,
Putin must be having a good laugh. He didn't know that he controlled American politics and that the Facebook posts of people will swing the votes in their appointed candidates, it belittles our intelligence agencies. It belittles us as Americans, that we are being manipulated by somebody sitting in Moscow.
So my thoughts on that are as follows. First of all, in my opinion, the US India relations is a very important factor for the future of the world. If these two countries get together and start working together in the interest of the world for the global good and the comity of nations, this can become the defining partnership of the 21st century. The second aspect is that they have pushed Russia too far. Like India has been asking the Western world to, have a more balanced approach towards Russia, because the further you push Russia into the Chinese camp, the more difficult it becomes for the Western world to tackle this new challenge of China and Russia together. Russia is a neutral country on the world stage without putting all its sort of strengths on the Chinese side as a collaborator would have been a far better situation for the Western world and for the global world. So, to that extent, US India partnership, along with the other countries, and Russia being neutral between these two sides or slightly more aligned towards the Western world, would have been a better format for the future of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining today. Wonderful insights and commentary, Ankit. Welcome to Jaipur Dialogue
Thanks.
USA for the first time. Wonderful to hear. But there's one lesson that I wanted to share with all the audience and you, that history is littered with corpses of men and women who forgot and ignored the simple facts or truths of history. So if you don't learn from history, history repeats itself. Thank you very much. All the viewers, like, subscribe, and support us. Thank you very much for being with us. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Wish you all the best for continuing the great work that you do.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Much appreciated.
Pleasure being here. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.